8 flights on average every shift. So you're handling between 80 and 100 flights in a day. And so that's where you get down into pricing strategy, right? The strategy is simple. You simply just have to put bumps on seats. The idea of having that public buildup gets people in the door. Airline employees was a noble profession. We put families back together. And I would argue that we probably have more freight capacity in conversion right now than we're actually going to need over the next 10 years.
Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm here today with Adam, consultant from Lagniappe. You know, I guess I'm not so good at words. Could give me a really good a really hard word, maybe I'll get it, but no. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. This is great.
So we originally met back in Miami. We had a common friend who introduced us at dinner one day, and to me, I really was interested by points you made on loyalty. So, and the stories you have, and you really have a great eye at the industry, you know, of what has happened, what is going to happen, and what's happening right now. And I mean, also because you've gone from one place in the industry to another. And so with that, what do you think is your favorite moment in the aviation, you know, in the industry?
Not really sure. There's so many great ones. Looking across my career, looking at what I've seen, what has happened, kind of a not really a stellar industry moment, but once upon a time I worked for Doug Parker, worked for him both as CEO at US Air, and then later when I joined American, he followed me during the merger. And Doug Parker used to tell us all the time that what we did as airline employees was a noble profession. We put families back together. And I'd never really given it a lot of thought until I want to say it was 2016. I was in Charlotte, and I was in Charlotte for the Regional Airline Association conference. But I go out to baggage claim, I go to grab my bag. I'm waiting to go get the cab downtown for the hotel. And I see this older couple waiting. And while I'm sitting there, I watch their daughter, and what's obviously their granddaughter, come down escalator. I see the grandmother in tears hugging the granddaughter. And what dawned on me was what I was watching was a set of grandparents who were meeting their 5-year-old granddaughter for the very first time. And I thought, wow, what I do day in and day out has a hand in making things like this happen. And so, yeah, it's not a grand industry moment, but it is a solid understanding of what we do and why we do it.
And at that point, you were in what position were you?
I was a manager at American Airlines. I was managing ramp operations at DFW. And so, you know, you're watching airplanes, you're trying to get aircraft out, you know, all day, every day. Operational size of DFW, the numbers aren't an exaggeration. As a manager, you're overseeing 10 to 12 gates, which you're watching 8 flights on average every shift. So you're handling between 80 and 100 flights in a day. During that period, you're bringing families in, you're putting families out, you're facilitating people's business trips, you're facilitating reunions, you're facilitating people being able to say their final goodbyes to their loved ones. There's all these things that are happening because the airline employee gets up and goes to work every day.
I guess when I was asking the question, I meant more strategy-wise of airlines, but I guess no, that is a really hard-taking start. I mean, really, and that shows a lot about you, know, because the whole point is strategy. But yeah, that really leaves something on the soul like that.
But it's what airline people do. We're making things happen, and those kind of things that we're making happen. Every one of our customers has a story, right? Everybody that gets on board is on board for a reason, whether they're going to a meeting, I'm a paying passenger. I've been a paying passenger now for 5 years. After leaving the industry, after leaving being staff, it's one thing to have been a staff member where I just jumped on a flight to go somewhere because that's what I wanted to do with my day off. I'm in that group that has a story. In many cases, I'm attending business meetings. Very rarely am I just headed up to meet with friends. Most of my family's within a 3-hour drive of where I live now. Many of my friends live in other cities, but a lot of them are in the airlines, so they come to me. So it's just different to be one of those people now after spending 20 years watching people come and go. Again, everybody has a story. To now being somebody that has a business trip and has to be there. or is just going and goofing off with friends, or seeing people they haven't seen in years. That's just it's different to be on the other side of it.
So do you feel that that does play a role for people who are working in strategy and aviation?
I think it does, because the industry, again, we facilitate moving people from point A to point B, right? That's what the industry does. We also facilitate the move of goods and cargo. So whether you're American running belly cargo and passengers, or you're FedEx just moving cargo, what you're doing in your strategy is you're trying to get this item to this person in this amount of time. You're trying to get this person to this place in this amount of time. So all of your scheduling, when you do a scheduling strategy, you are looking to see how long is it going to take to get there. When you're looking at how long it's going to take to get there, you have to look at what value do we provide? What need are we filling? There's absolutes in this. Do we fill the need of the customer? And so that's where you get down into pricing strategy, right? Do we have it's gotten a little broader since I was doing it, but in the years I've been doing it, we now don't just have first class discount first class, on wide bodies, business class, discount business class, and 4 to 8 fare buckets for economy anymore. What we have is first class, discount first class, business class, discount business class, main cabin plus. However you want to describe that, be it main cabin extra American, economy plus on United, comfort on Delta, more leg room on JetBlue, however you want to describe that. You have that main cabin plus that comes with benefits. And then you have main cabin. And then you have the ability to add on to main cabin. And you do this as you segment all the way to the back. And then you have the poor soul trapped in the middle seat who has basic economy. And that's it. So you're now segmenting economy. And I'll give you a great example. Once upon a time, United Airlines moved so much cargo between LA and Sydney that they needed 8 fare buckets on a 747. They had first class, discount first class, business, discount business, and 4 economy fares. And now United, on the other hand, in addition to the cargo it moves, has 27 classes of fare available on that flight. At least last time I looked, that may have changed. So if you're with United and you're watching this, the numbers are different. I haven't looked in about a year. But there was a time they had 27 classes of fares, including a half dozen business class fares on that flight. Well, why do we do that? We do that because the strategy says that somebody is willing to pay more than full fare economy, but doesn't want to pay what it's actually going to cost to fly in business class. And we want to capture that customer.
Wow. So how strong is that? That I mean, can you give an example of that where they, lower that in business to really capture that customer versus economy?
On average, and I use United as my example, but let's just talk about, XYZ Air, just a general, let's just be very generic in the airline here. That business class customer that doesn't want to pay full amount, and actually we can probably use Qatar as a really good example. They offer business light. Business light at one time didn't include the lounge, but it was $300 US cheaper than just business. And they only offered 4 seats, I think it was, in that class. So you only have 4 customers that met that class. But what they found, they stopped restricting lounge access because they found that most of the people that bought that were not Qatar Privilege Club members were still One World Emeralds. And so they still had access to the business class lounge regardless. But you're looking at that kind of flexibility. I've done it myself. I'll give you a great example. I was in Singapore last year, so 2022.
Your favorite city, your home?
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite city in the world. Lived there as a child. I go back on business every chance I get. If I have an opportunity to take a business trip there, I take it.
You're just not a Chris Flyer. I'm really sorry. I feel real pity for you. No.
I actually have a Chris Flyer membership, and what I do is convert my American Express points over.
Okay.
I fly business in Singapore when I do that.
Okay. No. I was mistaken. I remember you were telling me you were
normally I fly JAL over just because I'm a One World member. But I do make it a point if I can get suites. I'll use my points to get a suite flight. Unfortunately, Singapore Air has discontinued suites out of the U.S. So, but if I can get suites, I will take it.
I mean, you could take the long way around, but that's a different story.
Well, you could, but that requires going to London, because there's the only suites flights available in Singapore that are easy to get to from here are London. Well, London. Manchester doesn't even have suites anymore, nor does Tokyo. So you have to go to London. And by that point, you've spent enough money and time, you might as well just go through Tokyo and JAL and get there. I was in Singapore, and I was looking at, I'd actually taken SQ over. I was up here for a Wings event, and flew from here into Singapore on the nonstop. Took the 17.5-hour flight, first I'd ever done that. Did it in business. Again, American Express points converted to KrisFlyer. But coming back from the Singapore Air Show, maybe was I here for a Wings event? Actually, maybe I wasn't. Anyway, but I did come through JFK. I'm just never in New York unless I'm here for Wings, and so it confused me for a minute. But the return,
welcome back, yeah.
When booking the return, I was looking, what was it going to cost me to fly in business class from Singapore into DFW? $3,800 to get from Singapore to DFW, whether I connected in business class in Tokyo or I took Qatar through. So I started just playing around, seeing what it was going to cost me to go other places. I managed to book Qatar to JFK and then buy a full fare first class ticket on American from JFK to DFW, and that totaled out to $2,100. Between the two carriers. Yeah, it goes through. I because they had stopped the nonsense of no lounge with business light. I got a business light fare into JFK, in Q suites, and then grabbed first class out of JFK into DFW on American. You know, all attaching the perks of One World Emerald status, and it worked out. But once you stop flying staff and start having to spend your own money, you start really looking at what those options are and how that works out. And obviously there's a strategy behind that. There's not only a strategy as the consumer, but the airline has a strategy behind that too. You know, because as far as they know, as far as they care, they're just going to put a bum on a seat. You can harken this back to the earliest days of the industry. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker was asked to describe the airline industry. And he said, the strategy is simple. You simply just have to put bumps on seats.
Which is why we still have a lot of flimsy airlines. I don't know about the new A381. I mean, I give them some credit, you know.
Oh, we'll see what Global does. Yes, that's an interesting topic, actually. Looks like they've got an AOC in progress now with the CAA. They've got 3 A380s, all former Singapore Air, so they still have the SQ configurations. I wish them a lot of luck. I don't know if they can make any money.
I mean, I was reading today that they just their chief pilot is now one from Emirates, A380 pilot, who they just got today, and he's really pushing this on the social media. He's talking about it every day. New members who are joining. I mean, of course, you know, he has something, at least a show for it this time. There's an actual aircraft, A380.
Yes.
That was always the thing with other airlines, you know, making the announcements but no actual aircraft in place, you know.
Exactly, and there's been a lot of those. There are ATW articles that come out on a fairly regular basis about airlines that have high-end management teams, solid people that are well known, but there's no solid investment. There's no solid there's no solid airplane jet, and you know, I know of a couple of those, and you know, won't mention names, and I hope they do well, and they look like they're going to do okay. They look like they're going to get there, but you know, and part of it from a PR perspective is actually it's actually fairly smart, right? Because if you go out there and you keep your name out in the public, when you finally do get your aircraft and you do start the application process, whether you're an FAA, a U.S. carrier trying to get a 121 certificate, or you're trying to get a Type A certificate in the UK, or trying to get an EASA certificate. A lot of the new carriers are looking at Ireland because it's just the quickest way to get an EASA certificate. But regardless of where you're trying to get certified, there's always a public comment period. And if you've had your name out there,
and I mean, there can be criticism.
There can be criticism, but more importantly, there can be, hey, we need that because that'll lower fares. What they're hoping for is during the public comment period that the public will be looking forward to the carrier just as much as the management team is.
Has that actually happened?
You don't get a whole lot of public comments, interestingly enough. You don't. But PR strategy is PR strategy, right? Yeah. So you're keeping a positive vibe. When Virgin America started, nobody in the public said anything to the FAA. The airlines did. The airlines went to the DOT and tried really hard to keep them from starting. And that's how they ended up with David Cush instead of Fred Reed as CEO. They had built so much excitement in San Francisco of a new carrier coming that as soon as they got authorization to fly, the bookings just exploded. Okay, in the industry, we consider an aircraft with 85% load to be full.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you say you're running full because you're carrying an 85% load factor. They did not fly empty the entire 7 years they were in operation.
No, really? Because of the public.
Because of the pub, there was that public buildup. Now they had to tweak routes just like everybody else does, but there was that public buildup to launch. And when you get that public buildup to launch, people are waiting for it. People were waiting for Breeze when they launched. People were waiting for Avelo when they launched. The idea of having that public buildup gets people in the door. And so we go back to Captain Rickenbacker in the 1930s. Yeah. The industry is all about putting bums on seats. Yeah. And that's where we're at.
So do you think that that's the case with Northern Pacific? I mean, Northern Pacific, is there, I believe they delayed flights by a month. They're going to start flights in, I think, the next 2 weeks. Or next week. I'm not sure. I haven't, what is that the case with an airline like them? Or
I've met Rob McKinney. Rob's a fellow Purdue grad. We originally bonded over both being Boilermakers. Rob comes from a different type of aviation. He is a, Bitcoin whiz kid. And ran a private company, 135 operator for many years down in Southern California. And then decided to take the step into the 121 world when he rescued Raven out of bankruptcy. And, Rob did an amazing thing by rescuing Raven out of bankruptcy because the people at Raven needed a job, and even though aviation is Alaska's principal strength, you lose an airline job in Alaska, it's hard to find another one. So they brought Raven out of bankruptcy, and he's used that as his core. He didn't need a new operating certificate because all he had to do was to get Raven's operating certificate expanded
so there was no
to be able to fly the 757s and fly the longer haul routes. You got to go to the DOT. He's got to get the DOT's permission for some of these routes. He's got to get the countries on the other end's permission for those routes. The DOT comment periods are out there. The docket, I read the docket every once in a while. Is he going to be able to make it work? I don't know. I love the 757s. So let me preface with that. In my career, it is absolutely one of the best narrow bodies ever built. The closest thing that comes to being a replacement for that is the 321 LR. It is an incredible airplane. I love the 75. Now that I've said that, it's a 75 with the old AA configuration. 20 years with the 75's gone out of production. Yeah. Is it the right airplane? A decade ago, yes. Today, I don't know. I think he has found the right airplane for the wrong time. And honestly, Rob, if you watch this, I hope you prove me wrong. I do. I think you've got a good idea. I don't know that you picked the right airplane for it. And so we'll see where that goes. Northern Pacific has a chance, I think, because they do operate in a city that is known for being a transit hub. They do operate in a place where fuel, believe it or not, is actually relatively cheap compared to the national norm. It's what happens when you basically produce it all right there. And they operate someplace that is a absolute haven for Asian tourists in the summer. Japanese and Chinese tourists fly to Anchorage and Fairbanks throughout the summer. One of my good friends used to be, when I met her, she was a manager for Frontier, but she moved to Alaska. She took over managing a ground handling company in Fairbanks. And when I asked her what all she handled up there, she was it's a seasonal job, but during the summer, they have JL, Air China, ANA. There was a handful of other carriers, but it's chock full of Asian tourists all the time. The one time I was in Anchorage during the summer, I've actually been a couple of times during the winter.
Really? Oh, you've been to Anchorage? Really?
Yeah.
Why were you there?
I once upon a time dated a girl that lived on Kodiak, and we'd meet up in Anchorage because it was just easier to get there.
That explains it very well. Yeah.
The things you do for love, right?
Right.
It's not an uncommon thing to stand there and watch Air China hit the gate, watch JAL come in. These are heavily traffic seasonal routes for the Asian carriers.
But was that built up back in the 80s when, Korean Air and JAL would fly via Anchorage? Was that really and even China Airlines flew through Anchorage to New York, I think up until 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
And I think you're right. I think that's part of it. At least it's where those airports end up on the op spec, right? You had to have those airports on the op spec because you had to stop for fuel. Once upon a time, a good friend of mine worked at Swissport, I believe it was, where he handled Korean Air at DFW. And that flight flew Seoul to Anchorage, to DFW, to Atlanta.
Wow.
And then flew Atlanta, DFW, Seoul, Anchorage, Seoul.
And that was
2000.
That was still wow. Okay.
Hold on, that was 2000 actually. That was in 2000.
Wow, it's 2000.
They were still flying. They were flying 747-300s, I think, on that route at the time.
Wow, incredible.
So and then they eventually changed it. By 2001, they were flying Seoul to DFW, Atlanta, and then later they changed it Seoul, LA, DFW, and so Anchorage got cut out of the mix. And for many years, the only carrier that really had big operations, or carriers, I should say, that had big operations in Anchorage outside of either outside of Alaska were Northwest Cargo and FedEx. Those were the two big operations in Anchorage for the longest time. Going back to Northern Pacific, they struck a deal 2 years ago, I believe, to buy the North Terminal at Ted Stevens from the Airport Authority.
Yeah.
And so they've been in the process of completely renovating that terminal, which it's absolutely needed. That has needed a wrecking ball. Last time I was in it, it needed a wrecking ball. So they when you're talking about trying to build a modern airport, right? Yeah. So they've put the money into renovating the terminal. They've got the connecting opportunities inside Alaska because they have Raven. They are trying to build the connecting opportunities into the lower 48, which is, I think, an absolute possibility.
So explain about Mexico. Yeah, that's always the thing I've been mystified a bit.
Asians love Mexico. Mexicans love Asia. It just happens that way.
Tacos and sushi, yeah.
Aeromexico flies 6 times a week in a 787-9, I believe now, into Narita. That flight runs about 90% load factor. I don't know if you've been to Tokyo, but
I'm supposed to go in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So.
Good. When you go out to Narita City.
Yeah.
In Narita City, there's a bar called the Jet Lag Club. You've got to go. The Jet Lag Club is the bar for long-haul crews all over the world. You walk off the street into the Jet Lag bar, suddenly everything goes from Japanese to English. Everybody speaks English, no matter where they're from. There is a tradition of getting plastered in the Jet Lag bar and going and singing karaoke afterwards. I have not gone and sung karaoke afterwards, but I did have a good time in the Jet Lag Club. But in the Jet Lag Club, you'll meet crews from all over the world. I learned about them because I happened at breakfast one morning upon the FO for the Aeromexico flight, who was wearing a jet lag T-shirt that read on the back of it, "I am an airline crew member. Please roll me over for instructions." And on the front, it's something along the lines of, "I'm an airline crew member. It is obvious you have not caught me at my best. Please check my front pocket for my hotel key to determine what hotel I'm in. Please put me in a cab to my hotel. Tell the cab driver to bill it to my crew members, and my crew will take care of me." It's but it's pretty straightforward.
In English.
It's all written in English.
English.
There's also Japanese translation for it, but it's primarily written in English. But that's how I learned about Aeromexico flying to Tokyo and how and what kind of load they get, and because I had a great conversation with the Aeromexico crew.
What did they tell you?
They told me that they're always full. They do it 6 times a week. They're always full. And now this is 2018. But I've checked the schedule. That flight has returned with Japan reopening.
Just a couple months back.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's still that activity. And I would argue that it's probably gotten stronger with Delta's investment in Aeromexico, because now they don't have to worry about people flying to Atlanta to fly to Tokyo, or fly to LA to fly to Tokyo, if they want to fly Delta. Now you can fly from Bogota to Mexico City and then on to Tokyo, if that's what you want to do, and you're still booking with Delta. Technically, you still book it through Delta. You're flying Aeromexico. That money's still going into Delta's coffers. It's because we're at a point now that Delta essentially owns Aeromexico, and on the other side of the Atlantic, they essentially own Virgin.
Yeah.
So they own just enough to not run afoul of any legal issues on the other side.
Yeah.
Though it could be argued in England today, there are no legal issues on the other side because the UK government doesn't care about ownership anymore.
Which, while many 25 years, 35 years ago, this was a completely different story.
Correct. It was there was a massive issue when Singapore bought into Virgin 30 years ago.
What was the ownership stake at that time?
49%. So the 49% that Delta owns today, they bought directly from Singapore.
Oh, really? What role does that play with custom, with, that whole, or that, I mean, you would think that, okay, not that, I mean, I'm a big fan of Richard Branson, but to go from something more that hot, sexy, the hot, sexy 25 years ad with the song by Relax, I mean, it's still my favorite airline marketing ad you can ever find out there. And it cannot, even though they tried to replicate it with, I believe last year, it's nothing comparable.
No, and you go back to when they first introduced the lie flat sleeper seat on Virgin. They introduced the middle cabins where you could put the shroud down, or put the divider down, put the comforter out that overlaps the two, has the shroud. And only Richard Branson could get away with advertising it as the legitimate Mile High Club. I don't know about you, but I'm not risking that.
I still do think about this ad on a daily. I really do. No, I sometimes I'm just like, wow, this is the best airline marketing, because they did a documentary, I think 4 years ago, about Virgin Atlantic, and they did an interview with the marketing manager, and the marketing manager said, the scene where he's holding the phone and he drops it. They actually put a real naked woman in front of his eyes. That off the record, that was on the documentary though, and it's incredible how they actually, to get that real reaction of a guy seeing, what it is like to see a Virgin Atlantic flight. And I mean, not today, obviously, but still the same. Likewise,
Do you know who runs brand strategy at the airline?
No, who is?
Branson's daughter.
Oh, Branson's daughter. At that time, wow.
No, today.
She's
airline today. They are not the airline. They're not the shock factor airline they used to be. Yeah. Part of that is the Delta influence. Part of that's Air France KLM's ownership. And part of that is just business, right? Yeah. We've gotten to a point today in industry, and not just the airline industry, but industry overall. We don't want that shock factor. And it's interesting because we have a world that will accept more and more publicly. I mean, and it's going to sound like a funny example, but you walk into Hooters, what the girls are wearing.
Oh, we're talking about Hooters there now? We made the jump from Virgin to Hooters there?
No, I'm actually in the restaurants, but I'm giving you an example. You walk in there, and what the girls are wearing 40 years ago was shock factor.
Yeah.
Now, I can walk outside in most metropolitan cities.
Yeah,
and find a woman wearing less.
That's true. That is so true. And that plays a role of airline marketing?
Yeah, and that plays the same thing with marketing. It's funny because airline staff come with authority.
Yeah.
And uniforms provide authority. And so we don't want shock factor in our airlines anymore. We want authority, especially in the post 9/11 environment. We want to know that the guy with 4 stripes sitting on the floor of the flight deck door is the guy in charge.
Going back to where we started with Virgin, and where you're talking about, the in the U.S., where if you're a new airline, you get, or even in other countries, you can get you can get compliance.
The comment period.
Exactly. How was it for Richard Branson at that time?
So for bringing about Virgin in the 80s, he didn't have the public to worry about. He had BA to worry about, right? He had the support from Freddie Laker. He had the support from other airline entrepreneurs. But he still had a state-run company that he had to fight. And so he fought Lord Marshall. He dealt with a lot of those issues. That I don't know that the public comment period for the CAA existed in those days. The U.S. we've had it since deregulation. It's actually part of deregulation. But again, does the public comment much? No, it's the other airlines that tend to go to the DOT and say, should this carrier be allowed to operate? 9 times out of 10, it's posturing. You're just saying, hey, we don't want the competition, right? When Virgin America started, there was a little bit different there, where they were able to just not only say we don't want the competition, but is this really a U.S. carrier? And now the public comment period hasn't really been as much of an issue because the FAA has started taking on that role. There was a question from the DOT and FAA about what Connect Airlines looked like, whether or not it was a U.S. carrier. And so John Thomas at Walter Matilda had to go back and prove that Connect was not Canadian investors, it was U.S. investors. And so there's just those kind of things. And I understand where that question came from. His first route's into Billy Bishop. Well, if your first route's into Billy Bishop and you're looking at all these things that are going to serve Canadian customers, the question is, are you really a U.S. carrier? And so he had to prove it. He was able to do it, and now they've got their authority to operate. So that's just kind of how that works. And again, public comment period doesn't mean you really get public comments. What it means is that people can tell the U.S. government or tell the convening authority, do we want this operational? Do we think this is going to be a viable operation? And again, 9 times out of 10 is just posturing.
Do you think it's possible still today to start a flight? Let's just say you have one aircraft. I mean, I'm not trying to say Global is copying Virgin Atlantic, but Virgin Atlantic 1747 getting bombarded. Do you think it's possible just like that to start a transatlantic airline like that?
Sure, why not?
But successfully. I've seen it done. We've seen it done. Under the coat of a big, legacy carrier.
So, first off, Global has 3 airplanes now.
Yeah.
So they at least have the ability to put 2 airplanes into a schedule and have a spare, which is something a lot of startups don't think about. You have to be able to put 2 airplanes into a schedule and have a spare. So they have that. Is that going to work? Who knows? We'll see how that goes. The question isn't, can you take a wide-body airplane and build a successful transatlantic operation? It's, can you take an airplane as big as the A380 and do it successfully and do it profitably? You can get 600 people to fly between London and New York. It's the most popular transoceanic market in the world. Yeah. You can get 600 people on I guess it's 485, and let's be realistic, it's 485, including in the old Singapore Air configuration. You can fly that airplane Dallas, Houston, Albuquerque, Denver, even LA. But what fares do you have to set to get people to fly it? Yeah. You when you're flying out of Manchester or Heathrow, you now have to convince customers to abandon British Airways, to abandon Virgin, to abandon Aer Lingus. You have to convince them to abandon Delta, American, United. So, can you convince your customers to abandon 6 large established airlines? Point 1. The second thing is, if you can you convince them to abandon those carriers at a price point that is profitable? And it's the profitability factor that everybody forgets about. Cost per seat mile isn't just what is it going to cost you in fuel, what is it going to cost you in flight attendants, what's it going to cost you in flight deck. That cost per seat mile includes, do we cater it? Well, flight that long, you have to. That cost per seat mile includes what your ground crew on both ends cost, what your gates cost on both ends. Let's not forget that Heathrow is the most expensive airport in the world to operate into. It is more expensive than Miami, which once upon a time was the most expensive airport in the United States to operate into.
When was that? When was Miami?
Up until 2020. When Frontier moved in there, they had just cut a bunch of the cost.
So that was one of the highest yielding bases for American Airlines also.
It was, but American flew in there, but even American complained. It used to cost you, and I may have my numbers slightly off, but it used to cost something like $38 a passenger to enplane somebody in Miami. It doesn't cost that much to enplane somebody at JFK.
Wow. Oh.
So enplanements, the cost per enplanement is incredibly important when you're looking at it at an airport. Heathrow's expensive, Gatwick's expensive, Manchester not so much. But Manchester is Manchester. It's formerly Yorkshire. It's in a separate district now, but your catchment area is Yorkshire, Lancashire, southern Scotland. That's your catchment area for that. And most of those people are flying. You're going to fly British Airways. You're going to fly from Liverpool down to Heathrow and come across the Atlantic that way, or you're going to fly into Dublin and come across the Atlantic on Aer Lingus. And why wouldn't you? You have pre-clear into the U.S. there. So if you're going to Chicago or New York or Boston, that becomes, if you're in that catchment area, that becomes the better way to do it.
Yeah.
And so you have to look at this and go, with a carrier or an airplane that big, how do we turn that profitable? And there are ways. There are ways they can do that. They can pre-book cargo contracts. And if I were them, that's what I would be going after right now. You can put, I think it's 13 LD3s in the front and 16 in the back. I have to go look just to be right. I don't know if those are the exact numbers, but something along those. It's a little bit more cargo than what you can carry on a 777-300. And because you can do that, in pallets, of course, those numbers slightly shrink because of the size of pallets. But because you can do that, if I were global, I'd be calling up FedEx and UPS and Looks Air and all of the big cargo operators and saying, do you need to second out freight? Do you have overflow that needs to be moved? And I would be looking for cargo contracts, because if you want to get a wide body across the Atlantic profitably, I don't care what's plastered on the side. If it says American, United, British Airways, it doesn't matter. If you want to move that wide body across the Atlantic profitably, it better be carrying freight.
Do you think, because I always was curious with the idea that the KLM had the 747 Combi, why could there never be an airline that, at least does, half the aircraft cargo, half the aircraft seats? Or is that just not sufficient?
When you want to do something, you want to do it well, right? Yeah. And so unless you're flying a 737 Combi in Alaska, you're not doing that well. A Combi has a section of the airplane that carries freight in addition to what's in the belly. And it doesn't carry a lot of freight because it's only a section of the airplane. So you don't have that flexibility. And then you have the passengers. Well, the passengers don't weigh more than the freight. So now you're dealing with weight and balance issues. It's when you're wanting to do something well, you can't do it half, which is why a lot of those KLM routes, after they bought Martin Air Cargo, a lot of those KLM routes that were Combi became all KLM passenger, and there's a Martin Air route that runs at night into that same city. So KLM, and I'll give you Houston as an example. KLM Cargo runs to Houston every night. KLM runs to Houston every day.
Because of just the idea of keeping it simple.
Keeps it simple. And now KLM carries freight in the belly. KLM Cargo, that freighter has freight in the belly, freight all throughout the cab, what would have been the cabin. And so they run a lot more freight than you would if you were just running a Combi on a daily basis.
So why does it work in the cases like Iqaluit in Canada or Alaska? Why does it work in these, the Combi?
It works because in northern Canada, where Canadian North is flying their Combis, in northern Alaska, where Alaska Air is flying their Combis. And keep in mind, Alaska actually just retired its last Combi. They have nothing but freighters now. So they have passenger and they have freighters, just like KLM does now. Combis worked in those environments because cargo is what makes those cities functional. And they didn't, you can't run a Dash 8 in northern Alaska during the winter. You just can't. You can't run a 175 in some of those markets in the winter either. Beautiful airplane, love it, greatly enjoy flying it, but you can't run it in some of those markets in the winter either. So what do? You run a 737, and in the days of the Combi, you run the 737-400 all the way up to Barrow, northernmost city in the U.S.
Yeah.
You go to Barrow in a Combi. You take the freight off, which is all life-sustaining goods for the city. Passengers deplane. You don't have a whole lot of traffic into Barrow. People aren't going there on vacation. A warm day there is just above freezing. So you needed less people. So you needed the freight. But and go back to the Houston example with KLM, you have more and more people wanting to go to Houston. So you had to have, especially in the SkyTeam days going through connecting to Continental, you had to have people flying through there. And so you have to have a cabin full of people and a belly full of cargo and then a separate freighter, because there is freight coming out of the Netherlands into the U.S., from the U.S. out to the Netherlands.
Because you're just making me think this would also be a good strategy for a carrier like Norse. That's why, and that's why I would think, if there's such a, everyone has been saying cargo, even, if it was even before COVID, it was right after COVID, it would have been even way more successful than it is now, because now the market has been, I guess you could say, a bit more stabilized, and cargo carriers are not seeing, DHL and FedEx, they don't see this humongous rush for cargo because of supply chain issues as much as they did then now. So.
Yeah, the supply chain issues are still an issue. However, with the airlines bringing back belly capacity, you don't need that big ramp up. And I would argue that we probably have more freight capacity in conversion right now than we're actually going to need over the next 10 years.
Really?
Oh, yeah. FedEx just retired their MD series airplanes. So all the 11s, all the 10s, they're all gone. They're closing a maintenance base. They're closing 2 crew bases in response to it. They are consolidating all maintenance into Indianapolis. Well, I won't say all, but what was the LA maintenance base is going to Indy. So all those employees are being moved to Indy. The crew base at Cologne, Germany is being closed.
Oh, really?
The crew base in Alaska, or Anchorage, is being closed. And so now when a FedEx flight stops through Anchorage, it stops through Anchorage. They'll change crews there. You'll see the FedEx ground crew that works in that station do it. But there's no longer going to be a crew base. There's no administrative structure there any longer. So that's just the way reality is now, right? You don't need that administrative structure because there's no longer that size. The U.S. airlines have brought belly capacity back. Because that belly capacity is back, you're seeing a lot of their shippers are coming back to them instead of where they would previously use FedEx or UPS during the pandemic era. Now we're seeing those airlines come back. And so you can, and again, DFW, my home airport, you can stand in the terminal and watch wide body freight being loaded on wide bodies, both going to Europe, going to South America, and going to Asia. And it's a lot of freight. I mean, to the point that you have pilots that are listed as standby, and those standby pilots don't go unless there's something that needs to, unless it's an absolute or there's room. So you consolidate all the bags into cans, and then have room to slide that pallet out. Or you can get authorization from cargo to break that pallet down and place it in another can. There are ways to do it, but all that freight on that standby pallet is standby. Whether it's employee-driven freight which there isn't much internationally. There isn't much employee-driven freight internationally. But whether it's employee-driven freight or customer-driven freight. And a lot of times it's customer-driven freight that the customer just doesn't have a day it has to be there. It just needs to be there. And so it will sit and it will wait until there's space to put it up. So that's that. Cargo generates a lot of money. And not as much domestically as it does internationally. But when you're running a wide body, part of how you afford to build your fares above the wing are what you're putting in below the wing. So I'll give you a great example. When I worked at United, I worked at United Express. Our ticketing instructor would always make the comment. I'd been at the company at that point a month, maybe 2. And when she talked about surcharges, about excess baggage charges, and she says, it's because when you put a bag on that's in excess of the allowance or weighs more than the allowance, you are taking up room that United would otherwise use for cargo. And so it's the same thing. When you take up that room on an airliner, you're paying that because the airline's losing cargo revenue. But baggage always has priority.
So the role that loyalty because of the network as a whole, plays such a big, is really what causes there to be such a standby of cargo.
Correct.
Because in the end, it's not just about getting to the destination. It's about the contract you have to send the cargo you have to wherever it has to be sent.
Correct. Loyalty plays an important role in airline revenue, whether we're talking about cargo or we're talking about passengers.
Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, and looking forward to seeing you on the next episode.